we've had one class as an introduction to strategy, and we then have 4 classes talking about various elements of strategic position. We've got 4 unlabelled dots, unlabelled in that diagram, but one of them is labelled the environment, one is capabilities, one is purpose, and the 4th one is culture. So we're on to the 3rd of those today, strategic purpose. Before we get onto that, I just want to draw your attention to some of the many support services that the university offers to assist students, new students or old students, students who are having any sorts of issues or uncertainties. Deakin, like most Australian, well, I think all Australian universities, offers a wide range of support services. Some of these are academic and some are non-academic. This screen shows some of the student academic support services. There are language and learning advisors available to assist people who are having difficulty coping with the English language needs of the course. There are writing mentors who can assist students with quick queries about assignments and give you some guidance on writing. There are maths mentors who can provide assistance with issues you may have in relation to any mathematics. That certainly wouldn't be in relation to this unit, but you may be doing some other units which do require some level of maths. If you're having trouble, any sort of issues with that, maybe you get in touch with the maths mentors. There's also the Uni Start program. It's got lots of information available aimed at new students or people who have been students a few years ago, in some cases many years ago, come back to university and find it's not quite what it used to be, and maybe they're struggling. So that's very useful information there. There are many references in the study support site to assist students writing assignments. A very important part of writing assignments is referencing materials. The Deakin Guide to Referencing is there, and that's, I urge everybody actually, even if you think you know how to reference articles for the assignment, I suggest you all look at the Deakin Guide to Referencing to make sure that you get it right. So there are lots of academic support services available. Some are offered by professional advisors, some are offered by academics, some are offered by other students. If you feel you have any need for any of these services, please don't hesitate to make use of them. There is also a large amount of general, what you might call life support rather than academic support, available within the university. And this covers counselling, free confidential psychological support. There's a separate team that provides support for international students who may be experiencing some difficulties or issues. Deakin Central provides students with lots of assistance for services at the university. There's an accommodation office which provides advice about on-campus accommodation and off-campus accommodation. There's various financial assistance for students with financial difficulties, direct assistance or just information. Equity and diversity, the Disability Resource Centre, and general health and well-being. Deakin considers these sorts of things to be quite important to university life. We'd much rather have a bunch of happy, healthy students than those who are unhappy and unhealthy. So there's lots of services provided to help. If you feel you have any need for any of these services, please feel free to take advantage of them. Don't approach academic staff like me for any of these sorts of assistance, because we don't know anything about what they are and how they work. We can show you these sorts of slides, draw your attention to the existence of these services, but go and see the specialists, those who know what they're talking about in these areas, rather than academic staff. By all means, come and talk to the academic staff about academic issues to do with your units. Yes, of course. But with these ones, go and see the specialists. Okay, learning outcomes for topic 4. What are we going to be looking at? We're going to look at the strategic purpose of an organisation. And the strategic purpose of an organisation is often, not always, but often expressed in the form of a statement of the mission, vision, values and objectives of that organisation. And we'll talk more about each of those 4 characteristics shortly. So we want to assess what is the strategic purpose of an organisation. We'll look at corporate responsibility and personal ethics and how these relate to corporate purpose and corporate strategies. And we'll talk a little bit, but not very much, about what you do if your own personal ethics says we should be doing something, but your organisation says do something different, which you don't really approve of. Can be an interesting challenge. We'll look at different models of ownership of organisations and how different ownership models of an organisation can affect the strategy that the organisation adopts. We'll look at the implications for strategic purpose of 2 different models of corporate governance, that is, how an organisation is ultimately governed, controlled, shareholder governance and stakeholder governance. We'll look at those 2. And we'll finish up by, well, wait a moment, I've gone on. Okay, that's where we finish. There's 4 learning outcomes we've got. So, to move on to the first of those, strategic purpose. The strategic purpose of an organisation, basically, why does this organisation exist? Why are we here? Why is this organisation here? In the case of something like a university, the organisation exists in order to benefit society by conducting research and by educating students. That's essentially the corporate purpose of a university. Now, most universities will stretch that out a little bit, but basically they're the 2 purposes of almost all universities. A strategic purpose statement is really at a very general level. It's a very high level statement. It's not something you can directly go and do something about, but it's a very broad, very high level statement. It's often complex and with many aspects to it. As soon as you start to expand even a little bit the purpose statement of a university beyond just saying it's research and teaching, you start getting into lots of complications because everybody wants their particular area of activity to be included in the purpose statement, and the statement of purpose can get to be quite complex and many-sided. For most commercial organisations, somewhere in the statement of purpose, providing a return on investment is one of the objectives. For many organisations, it sort of swamps everything else and they become fixated on return on investment and profit to the exclusion of other characteristics. It's usually a pity if that happens too much and making a profit becomes essentially the sole purpose of the organisation. However, a clear statement of organisational purpose can greatly help everybody in the organisation be focused on just what is the purpose of this organisation, why are we doing what we are doing. So it can focus everyone's attention on the basic long-term goal of the organisation. And different organisations express their purpose in different ways, but it's quite common for organisations to state their purpose, as I said before, in terms of a mission statement, vision statement, value statement, and then some objectives. The mission is really the very basic question. Why do we do what we do? Why are we doing what we are doing? And that, in many cases, can be a bit complex. In others, it's a bit simpler. Again, in the university, the mission is to conduct research and to educate people. For companies, generally it will be to conduct business in a particular area in order to assist people achieve their goals in that area. The vision is very much an aspirational sort of statement. If things went really well, what would we be doing long term that's different from now? What is it we're trying to do in our organisation and with our organisation? What do we want to achieve in the longer term, 5, 10 years? That's the sort of timescale we're always talking about in strategy. What do we want to achieve for our organisation in that sort of timescale? And can we put it in a way that gets people excited, enthused? This sounds like an organisation I would like to work for. That's what we'd like to have in a vision statement. And then a statement of values talks about the ways in which we want to operate. Do we want to be known as a very ethical organisation? Do we want to be known as an organisation which puts a very high premium on respecting the environment? Do we want to be known as an organisation that always generates a very good return on shareholders' investment? And think of the consequences of that. So, do we want to be known as an organisation that values free and open discussion within the organisation, or are we an organisation that is much more focused on a set of rules and procedures to control what we do within the organisation? What sort of organisation are we? What sort of values do we bring to our vision? And then we get to the interface between strategy and day-to-day operations under the heading of objectives. These are more specific outcomes of what the organisation wants to achieve. These are often quantitative. There are some numbers there, but not always. So, in a bit more detail on each of those, the mission statement: what is the organisation fundamentally there for? What business are we in? What would be lost to the community if we weren't doing this? How do we make a difference, and why are we doing it all? Some mission statements are so broad and general that they really mean very little. Others are spot on, really convey the essence of what the organisation is trying to do. The vision statement is more about the future of the organisation. What difference are we going to make to the world in 10 years or 20 years? What do we want to achieve? And we want to put this in a vision statement in terms that will hopefully enthuse and excite people, make them interested in working for us, will enthuse, gain their commitment, and stretch their performance. Yes, if I work for this organisation, it's going to be hard work. They're going to stretch me, ask me to do things perhaps a bit beyond what I've done before. and hopefully that's a challenge which you will accept happily. So, this is what the vision statement tries to do. Values statement. A statement of corporate values should communicate the underlying and enduring core principles that define the way the organisation should operate. A university operates, as far as the academic staff are concerned, with not very many rules, not very many regulations. The academic staff are professionals, they have high levels of professional qualification, they are expected to be self-regulating, and that's part of the sort of value statement of a university. In contrast, something like the army, the police have much more rules, much more regulations that everybody must follow. They don't generally encourage the same level of open debate and discussion that a university is supposed to encourage. So different sorts of organisations quite legitimately have quite different statements of values. Some of the values that a university might profess would also be values that the police or the military would also accept, but some of them would be quite different. So what sort of values, what sorts of ways would your organisation like to work, like to see itself as working in? And these core values, as espoused in a statement of strategic purpose, these core values should remain as core values of the organisation, whatever happens to the organisation. It has prosperous years, it has more straitened years, but the core values, if they're really core values at the heart of what you do, they don't change. So they should remain intact, whatever the circumstances and constraints faced by the organisation. Now, it's one thing to have a corporate purpose set out in these terms, to have a set of values, for example. It's a different question as to the extent to which the organisation actually follows those values. Because we see in the media frequent reports of organisations, government agencies, companies misbehaving. I won't ask, but I'm sure a good number of you work for fast food type places, and lots of fast food type companies have in recent times been operating in ways that would not line up with the sorts of values I've been mentioning. They have exploited people, paid them well below what they should be paid, manipulated visa requirements, and done all sorts of quite unfriendly things that would not correlate with any statement of corporate values that they would be prepared to publish. And in not only small fast food chains, but major banks in this country have behaved in ways which are not consistent with the sorts of values most people would expect that the banks like these to adhere to. So having a statement of corporate values does not mean that the organisation will actually follow those values. It's easy to publish a statement of corporate purpose, including a set of values. It's much harder to make sure that everybody in the organisation actually follows those values. So we need to be very much aware of that. The difference between what the head office might say in its annual report and what the organisation actually does. The objectives are the fourth component of that statement of corporate purpose, and these are statements of more specific outcomes. Now, we're still talking about, these are strategic objectives. They're not talking about this week's sales figures or projections of next month's advertising spend. These objectives are strategic objectives, but they are more concrete than the statement of mission, vision and values. Many organisations will express their 5-10-year objectives in three groups: financial, market and social. The financial objectives are obviously very important. Our objective is to maintain a return on shareholders' funds that averages 15% per annum over the 10 years, or something like that. The market objective might be to increase our share of the domestic market for our products by 1% a year for the next decade, and to develop an international market which at the end of 10 years is at least 30% of the size of our domestic market. Now these have some numbers on them. They are broad objectives. They're saying nothing at all about how we go about achieving those objectives. But they are quantified, measurable, testable objectives which the organisation can set. And they may have also some objectives in terms of what we might call social terms, corporate social responsibility, how we operate in relation to environmental issues, equality issues, access issues, these kinds of things. You can have, in this sense, you can have things like reduce over the next 10 years our total corporate emissions of greenhouse gases by 50%, or increase the percentage of women in managerial ranks from whatever it is now to 40% at least, or something like that. Again, they're general objectives in the sense that there's absolutely nothing about how we go about achieving them, but they are clear strategic objectives that all of the rest of the operations of the organisation are geared towards achieving. Setting objectives can be very tricky. I mean, you're talking about 5-10 years. As we've seen, you cannot rely on anyone's predictions for what's going to happen over the next 5 or 10 years. But it's very useful to do this, to give everybody a clear idea of what they're trying to do and to set some targets that everybody is aiming for. Do the objectives need to be specific and quantified? Well, some of the examples I suggested were quantified. Some were moderately specific. For instance, to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from the whole of the company's operations by 50% in the next 10 years. That's a comparatively specific and quantified objective. In some cases you can do that. You can make an objective, a strategic objective that is specific and quantified. In some cases you can't put a number on it so easily, but you can still devise an objective. You need to identify core objectives that are crucial for survival. Now, in the current regulatory environment, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% is not crucial for survival. There is no rule from any level of government or the stock exchange saying that companies must reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. But it's possible that in 5 years' time there might be, so you need to be a bit careful. Maintaining profit levels, expanding market share, these may well be critical for survival. If we don't achieve this particular strategic objective, our future survival will probably be in question. So core objectives that are crucial for survival are really very fundamental indeed. They're very important and need to be specified. And then we can have a hierarchy of objectives, that we have these very broad objectives of the sort we talked about under that slide, and then we can classify, break them down, analyse them into more specific, finer level objectives. And for example, if we had an objective to decrease our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% in the next 5 years, we can only do that if we know what our current greenhouse gas emissions are, and then we can work out more specific sub-objectives which will lead us to that goal. So we would have the broad objective, and then we could analyse it to finer level objectives, specific objectives at each level in the hierarchy. So we finish up saying to the head of this particular manufacturing facility in the organisation that you're part of the organisation, you are particularly heavy emitter of greenhouse gases, you have to reduce your emissions by 60% in the next 5 years. Again, we're not telling you how to do it, that's your issue, but we're cascading down the hierarchy of objectives from the very broad general one to a specific one for each operational unit. So, we've talked about the 4 elements that make up the strategic purpose. These can all be so general that they really mean very little indeed. Our mission is to be the best manufacturer of motor vehicles on the planet. Well, great. Every motor manufacturer would like to be the best manufacturer of motor vehicles on the planet. It's very broad. It's not terribly specific. Statements of strategic purpose can be so general they have little value. And there are 3 ideas that we can use to help make them more meaningful, more relevant to the people in the organisation, more helpful for everybody in determining how the organisation is going to operate. So the first of them, statements should be focused as practical tools to help guide decision making by executives within the organisation. So something that is very broad and very general, and strategic statements are meant to be fairly broad and general, but with a strategic purpose, as I say, they can be so general they have very little value. Focus the statement on issues that can assist decision making. Does this statement help guide our decision making? In terms of objectives, 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, yes, that does help guide decision making, because if we're thinking of rebuilding a manufacturing facility, okay, we've got to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, so that is an important component of how we rebuild that facility. So that can guide, that is focused enough that it can help assist with decision making. Statements, so that's one of the 3 key ideas in trying to make the whole strategic purpose statement helpful. There's no point in doing it all if it's not going to help anybody. So as one of these 3 ideas to help make it helpful, focus as a practical tool to assist decision making. And then the statement should motivate people. Yes, this looks good. I like what this company is proposing in terms of its strategic purpose. This is something I can work for, I can work with, it looks good. So does your statement enthuse, excite and motivate people so that they will be happy to work for you and to stretch themselves and to stretch the organisation's performance. And thirdly, the statement should be clear, reasonably easy to communicate, and not too hard to remember. So something that is expressed in very roundabout language, that is repetitive or so vague that you can't work out what it is it's trying to say, doesn't cut the mustard. It doesn't do what it needs to do. So that's 3 suggestions for trying to make a strategic purpose statement really useful. So what influences strategic purpose? How do we decide on a strategic purpose? And what factors do we have to take into account? Well, we've got 4 factors affecting it. One is the ownership. Who owns the organisation? And remember, we're talking about a broad range of types of organisation in this course, so we may well have a broad range of types of ownership. Governance. How is the organisation governed? In the case of many a company, or many an organisation, not just a company, there is a group of people who form a committee. In the case of a company, they're usually called the board of directors. In the case of a university, they're usually called the council. At least in this country, they're called the university council. And that group of people, who usually are not full-time employees of the organisation, that group of people then employs somebody as a chief executive officer, and then the chief executive officer employs other people, and there can be quite complex governance structures. So the governance structure affects strategic purpose. The stakeholders. Stakeholders are all those who have a valid interest in the future of the organisation. So staff members of the organisation, both managerial and shop floor levels, they're stakeholders. For a listed company, all the shareholders are stakeholders. But of course, for a large company listed on the stock exchange, the number of shareholders could be in the millions, certainly in the tens or hundreds of thousands. So there could be a very large number of stakeholders. And then social responsibility, the extent of pressures arising from issues relating to social responsibility. This can also affect the strategic purpose of an organisation. So we'll look at the effect of ownership on the strategic purpose. The strategic purpose of an organisation is usually set by those who manage the organisation or by the owners. In some cases, the owners and the managers are the same thing, but very often they're not. The owners of a company listed on the stock exchange, the owners are the shareholders. As I said, there could be hundreds of thousands or indeed millions of shareholders. But the managers are a much smaller group of people. So ownership becomes important. There are a number of different forms of ownership, and we'll mention 4 here. There's the publicly listed company. This is the BHP Billiton, the Telstra, the Commonwealth Bank, these kinds of organisations. They're listed on the stock exchange. Anyone can go and buy shares in them. The number of shareholders they have, that is the number of owners they have, could well be measured in the millions. I'm a very small shareholder in BHP Billiton. I think I've got about 300 shares. They've got 600 million on offer. So I'm a very small shareholder. But I am part of the ownership group of the company. So a publicly listed company may have millions of people on its ownership list, but it will have fully professional management. The owners, with almost no exceptions, have no direct part at all in the management of the company. The owners, through the board of directors, employ the chief executive officer, and then the board and the chief executive officer employ other managers. But the individual owners have zero involvement in the management. It's fully professional management. And publicly listed companies are clearly interested in maximising their profits. It's not the only thing they're interested in, but it's a very important part of what they do. But even then, you still have the big question as to, are your operations, is your basic strategy going to be one of maximising short-term profits or long-term profits? And you get into arguments with your stakeholders over this, because some stakeholders, some shareholders in the company, will be people who are youngish, working, might have a good income from some other jobs. They don't depend on profits from the company for their current income. They'd be very happy for the company to spend lots of money on investing in future developments. It might take, if you're BHP Billiton, a mining company, it might take 7-10 years before an investment starts generating a return. Many of your shareholders will be perfectly happy with that. They don't want money from the company immediately. They'll forego an immediate dividend for a higher dividend 10-20 years in the future. On the other hand, many of the shareholders in the company will be superannuation funds or individuals who are at the stage in their lives when they are not employed, they are depending on dividends from a company for their day-to-day income, and they would much rather the company paid out short-term profits rather than investing profits to develop longer-term profits, because what's the benefit of a profit generated in 20 years' time to a shareholder who may not be alive in 20 years' time? So there's a real conflict over whether your profit maximisation is short-term or long-term. And one place to resolve that and to make it clear to everybody is in your strategic purpose. Then we have state-owned enterprises, organisations that may be like companies. They may be a direct government department, but they're owned usually directly by government. Such organisations very often have multiple strategic objectives. If you're the Australian Tax Office, in broad terms, you've got one objective, and that is to collect all the tax which is legally due to the government. If you're some other sorts of government agencies, you will have more diverse objectives than that. So you may have multiple strategic objectives, and you have to find some way of balancing them. You may be required to make a profit, but not maximise the profit. Making a profit may be an obligation placed on you by the political system, but making a profit is very different from maximising the profit. The university, for example, is required to make a profit. Governments get very upset if the universities consistently run a deficit. But the objective of the university is not to get it's not profit maximising. Okay, so there's a big difference there. The state-owned enterprises are profit-making generally, but not profit maximising, because they have multiple strategic objectives, and many of these strategic objectives will consume some of what otherwise might be called profit. And state-owned enterprises might have direct involvement of politicians, either built into their structure, or the politicians lean on the organisation and suggest to it that they really should be doing something in their own home electorate. So there can be political involvement in the operations and the strategies of state-owned enterprises. Then we have entrepreneurial businesses. These are largely owned and managed by the entrepreneur who founded them. There are lots of these. Most of them are small. Most of them stay small. Some get to medium size, some get to be very big, but most of them are smallish. Frequently they have professional managers, even though they are usually controlled by the founder. Some of them are large. What was the guy's name? Elon Musk, who was here a week or two ago. He's an entrepreneur. He founded Tesla, SpaceX, all sorts of things he's founded. I forget where he made his money in the first time around. One of the well-known tech companies, and then he's gone on to establish several other companies. Now he has lots of professional managers helping him, but he has very strong personal objectives. I mean, SpaceX is an example. He wants to send commercial paying tourists into space. It's a different objective from NASA. He uses different methods, and he's not too fussed over the costs of it at present. He's got a long-term strategic view. He wants to be the first and best to send tourists into space, and if it takes 10 or 15 years to repay everything, I think he's happy with that. I'm sure he'd rather it took 5 years, but he has strong personal objectives helping to drive his companies. And then we have family-owned businesses. These are quite common, usually owned by the family of whoever founded the business. An entrepreneur starts a business. Eventually the entrepreneur loses interest or dies. Ownership passes to the family, maybe to one person, maybe to a number of people in the family. Family-owned businesses are usually small or medium enterprises, but some of them are very large indeed. One of Australia's largest companies, Visy. You may have seen trucks driving around with Visy painted on them, collecting waste paper and other recyclable materials. Very large company. And the owner of Visy is regularly one of the 4 or 5 richest people in Australia. It's a family-owned company. It's very large, but most family-owned companies are small or medium. And family-owned companies often have quite strong private objectives other than profit maximisation. Often, they're a bit like state-owned enterprises. They're profit-making, but not profit maximising. Lots of family-owned businesses have the objective of, well, many a farm is family-owned. It's been in the one family for 5 generations, and the current family that owns it regards it as fundamentally important that the farm stay in the family. And so they will manage it subject to this very strong private objective of keeping the farm within the family. That is not a profit maximising objective. They want to make a profit, sure. They want to stay alive. They've got to eat. But they want the farm to stay in the family, and it doesn't have to be a farm. It could be a company, any sort of company. So there are often strong private objectives in a family-owned business. So clearly enough, when you've got this variation in the ownership structure of different sorts of organisations, the strategies that you have for the different kinds of organisations could differ quite substantially. And this is an attempt at illustrating some of what you can get out of it. On this vertical axis, we run from an exclusive focus on profit. A company we put up at the top of the table is focused on profit and nothing else. Profit at all costs, essentially. Down the bottom here, we have organisations that